Hi there, welcome to the video. My name's Josh, and today we'll be taking a look at 7 Psyker builds. Now, the main reason for this video is I actually forgot to include any Psyker builds in my original Psyker overview, so you can consider this to be Psyker Overview 2 Electric Boogaloo. And with that said, if you haven't seen my Psyker overview, or if you're not familiar with any of the feats or abilities that come with the Psyker, I would suggest checking out my Psyker overview just so you can get an idea of what their feats are and, in general, how the Psyker functions. So for the first build, we have what I call the Agony engine, which basically works off of the Agony effect, which can proc under certain conditions, and can also stack. Now, this one really depends on the actual damage of the dot, and assuming that the damage is decent, this should be a really fun build to play since it has a lot of synergies happening. So in the first column, you'd want to go with Kinetic Transference to replenish 50% toughness over 5 seconds on a Brain Burst kill, mainly because you'll be doing a lot of Brain Burst attacks. Then from the second column, Rack and Ruin, whenever you kill an elite or specialist with the Brain Burst, it applies 1 stack of Agony to all enemies within 3 meters of the target. In the third column, we'd be going with Psychic Communion. Whenever you or an ally in Coherency kills an enemy, you have a 5% chance to gain a Warp Charge. So this is to help you gain as many warp charges as possible, in addition to those that you'll gain from your Brain Burst kills. In the next column, we'll go with Kinetic Shield, since this will help reduce the toughness damage you'll be taking, as your Perils of the Warp will be sitting quite high most of the time. In the following column, we'll go with Kinetic Overload, so while you have maximum warp charges, gaining a warp charge instead applies a stack of Agony to a nearby enemy, prioritizing elite enemies. And in the final column, we'll be going with Agonizing Wave. Psychonetic's Wrath expends all warp charges and applies 1 stack of Agony to enemies hit. Enemies killed by Agony have a 10% chance to grant a warp charge. So basically, whenever you use your active ability, on top of knocking enemies over, it's also going to light them on fire. And then on top of that, you have the passive that whenever something dies from Agony, you have a 10% chance to gain another warp charge. Alright, so how does this build all come together? Basically, you'll be going around popping heads, stacking up your warp charges to 4 stacks, and prioritizing elites and specials since they'll spread Agony in an AoE around them. And whenever something dies from either yourself or an ally, there's a 5% chance to gain another warp charge, which will then spread Agony again to another nearby enemy, prioritizing an elite. And if an enemy does die from Agony, it's just a straight up 15% chance to gain another warp charge, which then spreads more Agony. And you can also manually spread your Agony by using your active ability, so this would work really well for an oncoming horde or big clusters of enemies, since you can knock them all over and then light them on fire, and then once they start dying, Agony's just going to get spread and stacked around everywhere. Also, since most of your ranged and area of effect damage is going to be coming from Brain Burst and Agony, you won't really need to worry about bringing the staff to your missions, so your weapon options will actually be quite open. You can really bring whatever you prefer. For the next build, we have what I call the Mage build. So this one you'll still be popping heads with, but it is more focused around using the Force staff. So in the first column, we have Warp Absorption, replenish 15% toughness when you kill an enemy with a warp-based attack, so that includes any attacks from your Force staff. Then in the next column, you could either go with Psychonetic's Wrath to increase the damage of your Force staff, or Inner Tranquility to get a few extra attacks off before hitting critical perils. In the following column, I believe Psychic Communion would be a really good option, since you'll be using your Force staff quite a lot, and not necessarily brain bursting quite as much, so just having that 5% chance to get those extra warp charges will be really handy. And for the next column, Kinetic Shield will be a really good general pick, since it'll just help reduce your overall damage taken. For the fifth column, we'd want to go with Warp Battery to increase the number of warp charges that we can store. And for the final column, we'd want to go with Quicken. So Psychonetic's Wrath removes all warp charges, reducing the cooldown by 12% for each warp charge removed. So if you have 6 warp charges at the time of using your active ability, it'll actually reduce the cooldown by 72%. So with this build, you'll just be constantly blowing up enemies with your Force staff, getting some warp charges from 5% of those kills, getting some more consistent warp charges from some Brain Burst kills, And then when you're at high warp charges and also high perils, you'll be using your active ability to reset your perils down to 0, and also having a significantly reduced cooldown on that active ability. And once you've done that, you'll just be repeating that cycle over and over again, blowing up enemies, building up your perils, building up warp charges, clearing it all with your active ability, and having that reduced cooldown. So this build will be really good for people who want to use Force Staff and use it frequently without having to manually vent your perils. Next we have the Speedy Head Popper build. This is probably the best beginner build here since it's fairly straightforward and also safe but effective with its playstyle. It's all about using Brain Burst as fast and frequently as possible and prioritising elite kills. So in the first column, we'll go with Kinetic Transference to get the extra toughness back on a Brain Burst kill, since we'll be Brain Bursting quite frequently. In the following column, we'll go with Inner Tranquility to reduce the perils generated from our abilities by 10% per warp charge. It does also slow down our quell speed, but we really won't be quelling too frequently with this build. For the next column, we'll go with Psychonetics Aura. This gives a 15% ability cooldown reduction to yourself and allies in coherency on an elite kill. So this is a good support option, but it'll also tie in with our main objective, which is going to be head popping elites. In the next column, we'll be taking Kinetic Shield, since our perils will be sitting quite high most of the time, so having that extra damage reduction will be nice. In the following column, Warp Battery will be another really good option, since it can increase the number of warp charges we store. And this also ties back in with Inner Tranquility, which reduces our perils generated from our abilities by 10% per warp charge, so it can get up to 60% less perils generated. And for the final column, we'd want to go with Kinetic Barrage, which for 10 seconds after using Psychonetic Wrath, your Brain Burst charges 25% faster and consumes 50% less perils. So that basically means that when combined with Inner Tranquility and Warp Battery, we'll effectively be generating 110% less perils of a warp from our Brain Burst, so in theory it should be entirely free. And then of course for those 10 seconds we'll also be able to Brain Burst quite quickly. So for this build you'll be running around, popping heads, getting your warp charges up, and then once you're in a situation where you have a high priority target like a boss or several elites or specials to take care of, you'll be using your active ability to start brain bursting faster and also making it free for 10 seconds. And if you can get a few elite kills off during this time as well, you'll be reducing the cooldown on your active ability for not just yourself but also your allies, and realistically you only need 7 elite kills to fully reset your cooldown. So really the only drawback to this build is if there doesn't happen to be any elites to kill after you've used your active ability, since then it might be a little while before you get to use your active ability again. The next build I've come up with is the Endless Head Popper build. This one's very similar to the last build we went over, but with one key difference. We changed the final column feat from Kinetic Barrage to Quicken. So this build should allow you to use your Brain Burst an almost infinite amount of times. You'll basically be popping heads, building up your warp charges, using your active ability to clear your perils of the warp, which then, from the warp charges, reduces the cooldown of the active ability by 72%, and then you just need to kill an elite or two to fully reset your active ability. Now you're probably asking yourself, all these builds seem to be based around lighting things on fire, blowing up their heads, or blowing them up with a staff. But what if you want to be a wizard with a gun? Well, that's where this 5th build comes into play. And this is also the highest single target damage build that I've come up with, so I call this the Boss Killer build. In the first column, you'd want to go with Kinetic Transference to replenish 50% toughness over 5 seconds on a Brain Burst kill, so we'll still be using some Brain Bursts with this build. In the following column, there's not a lot of synergy going on, so I'd suggest going with Psychonetics Wrath just to increase the damage of your Force weapon a bit, so I would suggest bringing along a Force Sword specifically. From the third column, we'd want to be going with Cerebral Lacerations. Damaging an enemy with your Brain Burst ability causes them to take plus 15% damage from all non-warp sources for 5 seconds, So this is really good against those stronger enemies, which can take a lot of hits, so you can brain burst them, then swap to your firearm and start blasting, and it will also help your allies deal more damage to the target as well. From the next column, we'll take Kinetic Deflection. While below Critical Peril, blocking an attack causes you to gain peril instead of losing stamina. So this will be handy with this build since we actually won't be building up our Perils of the Warp that high. But that said, we could also take Kinetic Shield in this row to help reduce some toughness damage taken. In the fifth column, we'll be taking Kinetic Flare. All attacks have a 10% chance on hit to brain burst the target. This cannot occur while at critical peril and has a 15-second cooldown. This will work really well with any weapons that have a high rate of fire and a high ammo capacity, so something like the auto gun or auto pistol. And for the final column, we'll be going with Kinetic Barrage. For 10 seconds after using Psychonetic Seraph, your brain burst charges 25% faster and consumes 50% less perils. So this will allow us to deal a lot of damage very quickly after using our active ability. Now let's get into how this build functions in a boss situation. So a boss shows up on the level. You'll start by attacking with Brain Burst, which will apply Cerebral Lacerations, increasing the damage of non-warp abilities by 15%, so that will apply to both yourself and your allies. You'll then onload with your gun into the boss, which should proc Kinetic Flare for a free Brain Burst. You'll then be using your active ability Psychonetic Seraph to trigger Kinetic Barrage, which will then allow you to just start spamming Brain Bursts very quickly for the next 10 seconds. Once those 10 seconds are up, there'll be a slight window before Kinetic Flare is back up, so you'll want to quell your perils below critical, and also reload your gun. And from there, you'll want to start blasting away again with your gun, which should again proc Kinetic Flare. And finally, once you've done that main part of rotation, you'll want to be either brain bursting and just quelling slightly between uses, or using Brain Burst and then swapping to your firearm and swapping backwards and forwards every 5 seconds, depending on what does the most damage, of course. For the 6th build, I've come up with something that's probably going to be considered fairly off-meta, since it's more intended for people that prefer the melee combat side of the game over the ranged combat. So this is the tank build for the Psyker. In the first column, we'll be taking Quietude to replenish 7% toughness for each 10% of peril quelled. From the second column, we'll take Psychonetic Seraph, since we'll mainly be using a Force Sword, and this will just help us deal a bit of extra damage. Now, because we'll be focusing on using the Force Sword in melee combat, we won't be popping heads quite as frequently, which means we won't be generating as many warp charges. So in the third column, we'd want to take Psychic Communion, since it'll just give us a way of generating some warp charges from time to time. From the fourth column, we'd want to be going with Kinetic Deflection. While below critical peril, blocking an attack causes you to gain peril instead of losing stamina. So this will really help us with managing our stamina better, and it'll also give us an extra layer of defense. In the fifth column, I'd be going with Warp Battery to increase the number of warp charges that can be stored. But you could also go with Kinetic Flare to increase your damage output a bit. And in the final column, I'd be going with Quicken to reduce the cooldown of my active ability per warp charge that I have stored, since we'll likely just be generating warp charges passively from time to time. And this also has some synergy with Quietude, since if you're able to vent your entire perils of the warp using your active ability, you'll actually regain 70 toughness. And if you're able to use your active ability more frequently, it means that you'll be able to regain these large chunks of toughness more frequently as well. Now let's get into why this build is so tanky. So it all comes down to the feat Kinetic Deflection, which is basically letting us use our Perils of the Warp meter as an extra blocking resource, rather than our stamina. This is going to be really good in those situations where your allies are downed, they're getting attacked by some melee enemies, but there's also some ranged enemies off to the side. That way you can use your active ability to knock over the ranged enemies, and just walk up and revive your allies, since you'll be able to eat a lot of damage from the Perils of the Warp, then it'll start going into your stamina, and then it'll start going into your toughness. So it would be very unlikely that the melee enemies would actually break through that while you're reviving someone. Now, while this next part may not be realistic of what happens in an actual game, it is at least interesting to look at. So with this build, assuming that 1 damage applies 1 to your Perils of the Warp meter, that would mean that you can basically absorb 100 damage, and then you can absorb a few hits for your stamina, then another 100 damage from your toughness, use your active ability to knock the enemies over and maybe get a couple of kills here and there, hopefully getting back to 100 toughness. You can then block another 100 damage through the perils of the warp, then block a few more hits with your stamina, then block another 100 damage with your toughness. Now, all of these builds that I've gone over have touched on every single feat except for one, and that is Mind in Motion. So this feat is a bit of an odd one. Your movement speed is not reduced while quelling peril. So with the way Perils of the Warp currently functions, you actually only need to vent just a couple of % for a moment to get below critical, and then you can use your Brain Burst again. So the reduced movement speed that you incur while venting actually isn't that much of a detriment, and picking this feat to get around that just doesn't feel like as strong of an option compared to some of the other feats in this column, which is why this hasn't been utilised in any of the builds so far. But nonetheless, I've come up with a build that I think will work for this feat. I'll actually show you my thought process for this one. So we'll start with Mind in Motion itself, so our movement speed isn't reduced while quelling. Now, because we'll be quelling our perils from time to time manually, we'll probably want to take Quietude, just so we're actually getting some toughness back while we are quelling. And since Quietude benefits from using your active ability frequently to regain large chunks of toughness, we would actually want to be taking Quicken from the final row. That way we're actually reducing the cooldown of our active ability based on our current warp charges. Now that also has a direct synergy with Warp Battery, which increases the number of warp charges that we can store. And we also have another direct synergy from Psychic Communion, which will sometimes help us get additional warp charges on a kill. And lastly, from the second column, we'd want to be taking Psychonetics Wrath just to increase the damage that we'll be dealing with our Force weapons. So you'll probably want to be using a Force Staff, since it's a little bit harder to get around the Perils of the Warp by venting just a little bit with the Force Staff. That's more of a Brain Burst trick. And you'll be wanting to use your active ability whenever you're at high Perils of the Warp, and also have a few warp charges. That way you can regain a chunk of toughness and also reduce the cooldown of the active ability itself for the next use. So this build will probably feel very similar to the Mage build I went over earlier, but with the key difference being the mobility itself and also how the toughness is regained, since you'll likely be able to just vent while repositioning quite frequently. And if you do happen to be in a situation where you are at high perils and you do need to reposition to a different spot, you can just vent while moving and eat a couple of shots while regenerating your toughness. That said, that's probably not a smart thing to do on the higher difficulties, since you'll just get chewed up by ranged attacks. So yeah, I think this feat is viable, but it's probably not optimal when compared to the other feats in that column. But who knows, maybe Perils of the Warp will be changed on the official release, and maybe you won't be able to get away with mini-venting anymore, and you'll actually need to vent large chunks at a time. In which case, this will become a much more enticing pick, since you'll be able to vent and reposition yourself at the same time. Alright, that covers all the builds I've come up with for Psyker. If you've made it this far into the video, let me know which build sounded fun to you, or if you have a build of your own. Remember to like, comment and subscribe, it helps out since I'm a new channel. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.